All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at two totally different but massively impactful stories that really highlight just how fast established rules can be flipped completely upside down. First, we're going to see how a hyper-local drug charge down in Texas managed to rewrite constitutional law at the Supreme Court. And then, we're shifting gears to look at how a sudden border skirmish essentially froze a massive global peace treaty. We've got a ton of ground to cover, so let's get right into it.
So, does using marijuana mean you automatically lose your gun rights? It sounds like a straightforward question, but it sits at the absolute center of our first topic today. We're looking at an unprecedented collision between casual drug use and the U.S. Constitution. I mean, as more and more states legalize weed, millions of Americans are finding themselves stuck in this really weird legal gray area. It completely forces the question, can a fairly common habit literally strip you of a constitutional right?
Like I said, packed explainer today. Here is our roadmap. First up, guns, drugs, and SCOTUS. Then we'll look at the historical how and why. After that, we pivot to Middle East peace stalled. And finally, the diplomatic ripple effect. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, guns, drugs, and SCOTUS.
This whole thing revolves around a guy named Ali Himani, who's a dual citizen of the US and Pakistan, living near Dallas. So back in 2022, government agents searched his family home looking for terrorism ties. Spoiler alert, they found absolutely zero evidence of terrorism. But Himani was totally cooperative through the whole thing. He voluntarily handed over a gun he kept in the house, and he just casually mentioned to the agents that, he smoked marijuana about every other day. Well, jump forward over 6 months, and the government decides to hit him with federal charges. Not for terrorism, but literally just because he admitted to using weed while having a gun in his own house.
And that brings us to this number right here, 15. Under the Federal Gun Control Act, Himani was suddenly staring down a maximum of 15 years in federal prison and a permanent, lifetime ban on owning a gun. Think about that for a second. The government wasn't claiming he was a severe addict. They didn't say he was dangerous or that he'd ever even misused the weapon. Just the mere fact that he was a regular user of a controlled substance who also possessed a firearm triggered this insanely massive penalty.
Obviously, Himani fought back, arguing this totally violated his Second Amendment rights. Now, to understand how the Supreme Court ended up ruling in his favor, you have to know the rules of the game they're playing. It's called the Bruin test. It's a framework from an older case that basically says, to disarm someone today, the government actually has to play historian. They bear the heavy burden of finding a historical analog. They have to prove that modern gun laws are completely consistent with early American traditions. So the how and the why of the modern law have to match the laws from the founding era.
Which brings us right into Section 2, the historical how and why. So, to pass this Bruin test, the government said, hey, look at early American habitual drunkard laws. That's our historical match. But Justice Gorsuch, writing for the 6-3 majority, absolutely dismantled that argument. He basically pointed out that early America actually had a pretty hardcore culture of copious drinking. I mean, he literally noted that John Adams drank hard cider for breakfast. Because of that, historical laws only targeted people who drank so much they were practically incapacitated and incapable of managing their own affairs. The modern law, on the other hand, automatically sweeps up anyone who regularly uses a controlled substance, regardless of whether it makes them dangerous or incapacitated. The comparison just totally fell apart.
And if you look at this table, it perfectly illustrates Gorsuch's broader point. When you dig into the actual historical purpose of these old laws, they are miles away from the modern government's goals. Vagrancy laws, they were just about forcing people to be productive. Civil commitment laws were to stop habitual drunkards from destroying their families' bank accounts. Surety laws were to protect towns from public scandals. Literally none of these were designed to categorically strip citizens of their constitutional right to bear arms without due process just to prevent violence. The why and the how were a total mismatch.
But man, the conversation didn't even stop there. While the majority was laser-focused on history, Justice Clarence Thomas dropped a really fascinating concurrence. He essentially questioned whether the federal government even has the constitutional authority to regulate local gun possession under the Commerce Clause, just because a gun might have crossed state lines at some point in the past. It's a huge signal that the courts might soon be reevaluating the entire foundation of how the feds regulate local gun ownership.
Now, on the other side of the bench, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson actually agreed that Himani shouldn't lose his guns, but she absolutely blasted the Bruin framework itself. She argued that forcing modern judges to play amateur historian and dig through centuries-old evidence is just completely unworkable. She wants to go back to a more practical test where courts just weigh public safety against individual rights. It's a really stark reminder of the massive philosophical divide still happening right now in the court.
All right, let's take a breath, mentally reset, and shift globally to Section 3, Middle East peace stalled. So, what started off as this historic French-brokered peace agreement meant to end a brutal 15-week war between the US and Iran was suddenly thrown into absolute chaos this week. Just recently, President Donald Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a memorandum of understanding over in Versailles. It really looked like this conflict, which kicked off back in February after US-Israeli strikes killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was finally wrapping up. They opened up this critical 60-day window to negotiate the permanent terms for Iran's nuclear program and global shipping routes.
But just look at this timeline. It gives you this terrifying zoom-out effect on how fragile global politics really are. Literally days after they shook hands in Versailles, Hezbollah forces in Lebanon killed 4 Israeli soldiers. Within hours, the Israeli military hit back hard, striking over 80 targets in southern Lebanon and killing at least 47 people. And because Iran had basically drawn a line in the sand saying Lebanon had to be protected under any peace deal, these local strikes derailed the entire global summit. The implementation talks that were supposed to happen today in Switzerland with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance abruptly postponed.
And that brings us right into Section 4, the diplomatic ripple effect.
Back in the U.S., President Trump is taking some heat from domestic allies who think he gave up way too much just to get a deal done before the midterms. But Trump took to social media to fiercely defend his position. He pushed back hard on the narrative that America acted out of desperation, insisting it was Iran who was desperate. And he really hammered home the financial constraints, emphasizing that during this 60-day pause, Iran gets absolutely nothing, not 10 cents.
On the flip side, Tehran's top negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibafeh, released this incredibly stark warning. He made it crystal clear that Iran isn't backing away from its red lines. With commercial shipping just starting to move again in the supercritical Strait of Hormuz, the stakes are astronomical right now. He straight up said their fingers are still on the trigger if the US or its allies push too far. The posturing is intense, and right now, actual diplomacy is completely frozen.
And you can literally see the alliances fracturing in real time here. Look at these differing perspectives. You've got U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance showing some pretty rare exasperation with Israel, saying, you can't just kill your way out of national security problems. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is doubling down, insisting the army is staying in Lebanon to make Hezbollah pay a heavy price. And then you have Israeli Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir going to the extreme, declaring that all of Lebanon must burn after the soldiers' deaths. It's just a wildly combustible situation where tiny local retaliations are dictating massive international treaties. Okay, before we wrap, here's a rapid-fire look at what else is buzzing in the background this week. President Trump just unveiled a temporary Air Force One. It's a converted 747 gifted by Qatar, but it's stirring up some controversy because a $400 million jet kind of blows past the standard $50 limit on unsolicited political gifts. Also in D.C., Bill Pulte just stepped up as the acting director of national intelligence after Tulsi Gabbard ended her run early. And on a lighter note, World Cup 2026 is heating up. The USA, Brazil, and Spain all grabbed big wins, while Turkey officially got knocked out of the running.
But to bring it all back home for today, I want to leave you with this to chew on. We just watched a guy's casual admission of smoking weed completely dismantle decades of federal gun law. And we watched a tragic but relatively small border fight in Lebanon instantly freeze a massive multi-nation peace treaty. When the dominoes can fall this fast, it really makes you wonder, how permanent are the rules that actually govern our world? Definitely something to keep in mind as you watch the news this week. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and we will catch you next time.